believe it's a good afternoon for all of us. And welcome back to our afternoon workshops with Professor Willie James Jennings from Yale University. We've had a tremendous morning session together, and now we're going to, as it were, let our hair down a little bit and engage Professor Jennings directly in Q&A. That's our format this afternoon. Let me just say that numbers of questions have been submitted in advance, and we have asked our associates, Lita Little-Giddens and Professor Matt Wickman, to be our question facilitators. I'm going to introduce them for a moment, but to prepare you as the audience, there will be opportunity, even though there have been questions submitted in advance that we're going to be entertaining. The door is open for you to ask questions on the Q&A line there. So please feel free to jump in, and not everybody's question will be able to be asked and answered, but our facilitators will do what is best and appropriate and possible in that area. So let me just again say that we are delighted to have Professor Jennings. If you were not able to join us this morning, I wish you would take a moment to examine our website, where we have a lovely bio of this really impressive scholar, activist, pastor, and gentleman. He has written numbers of significant works, including the book that we are discussing today, which has won the major prizes in religious studies: The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, profound. And in addition, he has been involved in many other community endeavors. He speaks to a variety of audiences, always with an eye to conveying a vision of how to help us as a society heal and move forward. He's a Baptist minister as well. So you have, and if you heard this morning, you had a wonderful combination of great intellectual substance and a kind of pastoral, down on the ground, touch-based reality with ordinary folks and our concerns. We appreciate that unique blend there. That's Professor Jennings. You'll soon see all of that. But let me just quickly introduce Lita Giddens, who you see here. Lita has been a driving force for us on this campus in issues that we are discussing today. She directs, manages, coordinates the Family, Home, and Social Sciences, Diversity, Collaboration, and Inclusion Committee initiative. She serves on the university's Race, Equity, and Belonging Committee. And this may sound bureaucratic, but when you know Lita, you know there is heart and vision, and she's just the right person to have an impact here on our campus. At the same time, we welcome on Professor Matt Wickman, who is one of my heroes. When I think of a great professor, I think of someone like Matt Wickman, who's brilliant, humble, engaging, personable, and just insightful. And so I rounded up the best two people I could find for this Q&A, and they are the ones that are kind of curating, and they will be the ones that from this point forward, you won't be hearing much from me. Instead, you'll be hearing Matt and Lita kind of facilitate and generate the questions and move us forward. So with that said, I'm going to, as we like to say in our community here, Professor Jennings, I'm going to turn the time over to Lita.
Thank you, Grant. First of all, yeah, it is my privilege to be able to toss out the first question to you, Dr. Jennings, but I just first need to thank you for the lecture you gave this morning. I was so deeply moved by the clarity and spirit by which you deliver um, these truths that are so important for what I am personally engaged in, but also just in my life. Um, so with that, I also want to share with everyone that I got a text in between these, from this morning lecture till this time, from a student that said that this experience is changing their life. And so thank God for you coming and sharing your, I know you have such knowledge, but your spirit and being such a man of God and such a model. I want to thank you for that.
Thank
Um,
you so much, Minister.
so
Thank
as I mentioned, with the power you already are having on students, I have a question to toss out to you from a student on campus. And the name is Mikado Hunter. And this is the question. 10 years have passed. Dr. Jennings, is Christian Imagination published? How do you feel about the book's reception and impact? Is the first question. What has happened that you hoped would? Second question. Are you writing this down? Should I hold off? Because there is a list.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, please. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. How do you feel about the book's reception and impact? What has happened that you hoped would? And then this person asked, I'm going to save that because it's about the second book. So let's focus on those two, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me again thank Dr. Underwood and all the sectors and offices of the institution, university that invited me. It's been such a joy to be with you. And thank you, Dr. Giddens, for your willingness, you and Dr. Whitman, to host these questions. I am just so glad to be here with you. Well, let me respond to Mr. Hunter's very, very fine question. Well, I have been very pleased with the reception. And these matters, these things always come slowly as people are getting used to the book. The goal was to have people who normally would not be reading this kind of text to read it, and then the possibility of them being in conversation. So I have been gratified over the years to see more and more people reading the book, especially students. And what has been a real blessing is to see it hit the lives of students at some of those crucial moments when they're trying to decide whether they're going to decide a major, whether they're going to go and do master's work, what kind of master's work they're going to do, how they're going to see themselves as ministers or as scholars or other fields of endeavor. And students and at the doctoral level are trying to figure out their dissertations and their ideas. So to see the book hit in those ways has been exciting. What I hope will happen, and it's slowly happening, is I'm really trying to get together a larger group of people, both inside and outside the academy. So as I say at the very end of the book, I long for the day when I can get all the various folks who teach in universities and in divinity schools and seminaries, alongside people who do real estate and land development and community development, alongside people who work with the homeless, alongside architects and city planners and city engineers, to all thinking out loud together about what's the kind of world we want to live in. So I'm hoping that will yet come to fruition.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. Mikado is actually live. And Mikado, do you have any comments you would like to respond to and ask your second question?
Thank you again for your response, Professor Jennings. I'm glad to hear that what you're hoping to see has been happening, if slowly. And I guess the last part of my question about the Christian imagination was if there's anything that you hoped would happen that that didn't happen, something you thought would happen after the book released that you didn't end up seeing.
Well, actually, no, there was nothing. Well, let me take that back. There was one thing. I was hoping more of my theological colleagues, the people who teach specifically theology, theologians, would have engaged me more directly on some of the matters of the book. But I think it has only just now slowly started to hit them that I'm really talking about their own formation as theologians. But again, Mr. Hunnam, I live in hope. So I hope that there will be a day in which they will start to engage me more directly about these questions. But thank you for your very fine questions.
Thank you.
I've got a question for you, Professor Jennings, if I may.
Mhm.
I found, again, your book is so rich. It's dense, it's fascinating, it's very thoroughly, rigorously thought through. And your lecture this morning was so clear. I mean, I love the both ends of the spectrum here that you're covering. When I first saw the book title and began reading in the book, I was first persuaded by what you were arguing. I had a question that was kind of rooting around there. So the title of the book, The Christian Imagination, the subtitle, Theology and the Origins of Race. As you think about the subject, would it be conceivable that there were a book titled The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of, say, Gender, or Theology and the Origins of Class, or Theology and the Origins of the Anthropocene, or is race really the essential categories we think about these various kinds of differences that we deal with socially?
Thank you, Dr. Wynn, for that great question. Well, I do think that there can certainly be volumes that would address the architecture of all the matters that you just named. I do think I would love for people who are interested in such an endeavor to not lose sight of the racial dynamic that is at play. I never like to play these things off against one another. So, and I tell people to think about this like the quilt, but even more so a weaving of pieces into other things, and so that the racial logic weaves itself into so much. But I do think what distinguishes this particular angle, it is that social imagination, and it is the way Christians imagine belonging, or should I say, don't imagine belonging, that distinguishes the problem here at the very site of the origins of race. And so, even though one could imagine similar problems with gender, with the Anthropocene, with money, and the development of economies, what underlies so much of that in the West is really this way of imagining the social.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have another question from a participant. And this particular question, I was reading about this and I was so moved by it. And here's the question. In speaking of Zurara, is that how you say the name, Dr. Jennings?
Zurara, yes, Zurara.
Zurara.
Yes.
And speaking of Zurara, you stated that one should not read moral disgust into his words, even though he is attempting to justify the maltreatment of the Black body. Are we to infer from this assessment that racist ideas are a product of racist policies, or, put another way, that racist ideas were used to justify racist policies rather than the other way around? If so, what kind of implications does that have for how we address racism in the Christian church?
Great question. So let's recall with Zurara, what we have in his account is really, in many ways, a kind of coping mechanism with what he is seeing. He is seeing a horror unfolding in front of his eyes, watching this woman in profound tears as her children are being stripped from her, and drawing on his theological vision to, in a sense, not only justify, but primarily to create a coping mechanism for him with what he is seeing. So it's a Christianity that is being called into service to justify and to adjust a soul to an economic reality that destroys flesh. Now, if we keep that in mind, then what we realize is that as racial ideas, and then racist reasoning develops, it is obviously prior to policy. And so the challenge is that how do we crumble the energy and engine that is that racist reasoning, that racist ideology that then, like a parent giving birth to children, generates various kinds of policy possibilities. And what that means for the church is that we ought to be about helping people see what stands before their policy suggestions, their policy thinking, their policy construction. What kind of moral vision drives it? Recognizing the long history of theology being used to justify greed and control. And so I think that's the way we can start to figure out what we ought to be about.
Thank you.
There's another question here, Lita. Maybe, I'm not sure you saw this one, but this is from a colleague of mine in the English department, Keith Lawrence, he asks about the complexity of colonizer desire. Here's his question as he frames it. How does the colonizer desire to also establish connections with the new land, some of them going far beyond purely commercial motivations or instincts? How does that desire fit with the larger paradigm of colonial displacement of indigenes from the land?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So the colonizers found themselves inside two forests of feelings, if you will, as they came to the New World. The one is being overwhelmed by its majesty, its beauty, and its expansiveness. We forget what it must have been like for people of the old world to come to the new world. The old world in which, you know, for the vast majority of your life before you come, you might have lived within a 25 to 75 mile radius. I mean, that was your whole world. And you come to the new world, and all of a sudden, imagine the first time someone sees the Rocky Mountains. Someone sees the what becomes known the Shenandoah Valley, the Pacific Ocean, the Great Lakes. And to remember that at those times, we're talking about trees that resemble the old growth trees in California, and animals and creatures you've never seen, and multiple peoples, utterly overwhelming. And so there is an awesome and an awestruck reality for so many, and as they talk about in their journals, as they talk about coming, it's just overwhelming. But that forest of feelings is tied to another forest of feelings, and that is they look out and someone whispers in their ears, all of this is yours. Oh, this is mine. All of this. And they then whisper in another ear, God wants it that way. And what that does for one's spirituality, what that does for one's sense of who you are as a Christian, what that does for one's sense of providence and responsibility. God has given all this to me. Well, what about the indigenous peoples? Don't worry about that. We're talking about what God has said to me. God has given all of this to me. Now, fast forward. What this then means is that the settlers who come, they develop very quickly an attachment to the land. But this is a different kind of attachment. It's an attachment built inside possession. And that one word, as I mentioned earlier, is the key difference here that we're talking about. And people often get confused about this. And to say it simply, I like to put it this way. The settlers came and thought their life with God and their life in the world through possessing the land that God had given. The indigenous peoples understood their life in the world and the life with their gods through being possessed by the land. That is, who they were inextricably tied to this land. Now, a connection, sentimentality, a love for, commitment to, it's there on both sides, but the one is a relationship of property that can be exchanged for another reality of property. Right? This farm is wonderful and it's productive, but there comes a point when it's not as productive. And there's another possibility for a new farm. Would you be willing to go? Yes, of course. And I'll develop an attachment with that piece of land. And so attachment to place is there, but it's a different vision of place. Most specifically, the land and the animals, they do not speak. They're not alive in that way in which they may claim on my very existence. They are my tools. They are there for me to enjoy and there to use within the colonial frame. But then the other, there's much more going on.
Wow. That response is fantastic, and it leads to the next question, actually. And this question is from Professor Brian Korth. And this is what he wants to know about displacement as it relates to parenting. We'd like to know how parents have perpetuated displacement in raising their children, and how parents can break the cycle of displacement. Displacement and segregation is not only societally systemic, but embedded in parenting the next generation. Oof.
Oh, that's a beautiful question. And it's a beautiful insight as well. We are all cultivated in the normalization and naturalization of displacement, as I said. We have all been habituated in believing, whether we admit it to ourselves or not, that place really is inconsequential to how we live and how we understand our living. Place is utility. And the way it happens at the level of training our children is that we tell them implicitly and sometimes explicitly that the world outside our home, the ground that we stand upon, it's just dirt. It's not alive. It's not communicative. It's not speaking to us in any substantive way. And so your need to know the history of the place, my son, my daughter, that's not important. Other things to be learned, but the history of the place, who's here, who was here, what peoples called this land home, what trees are here, what animals are here, what does this place feel like? How do we sense it? This is not a part of the education most of us offer. And so as I was saying in the lecture, so what that means is that we give our children no sense of deep connectivity. I don't mean ownership, that's different, but no sense of deep connectivity. And without a deep sense of connectivity, whatever reality of relationality we present to them, morally, ethically, is going to be shallow. It's already compromised. Why is that? Because a deep sense of connectivity means that I learn to sense the place and I sense those who share the place with me. And so my moral and ethical vision reaches to them. I don't live my life thinking that my business, my concerns end at the property line, as so many of us are taught to think. It's not my property, it's not my concern. And so that invisible line becomes a real line inside of our hearts and minds and our moral vision. So we teach our children to normalize a displacement that has profound moral effects upon us. I was many years ago, I was in South Africa near Durban, and someone took me to this extremely large mall. I mean, it's a massive 3-story mall. three-level mall in Durban, and it looked like it could have been in Los Angeles or the mall in Minnesota or anywhere else. And then we came outside, and at the end of this massive parking lot was a large shanty town, cardboard homes, and tin places, and pieces of wood, where people living inside. And I stood there looking at the mall, looking at the shanty town, looking at the mall, looking at the shanty. And I thought, this is obscene. But this is what happens when one has been trained inside property relations, so that I can drive by, I can walk by people in desperate need. And because it is not my property, it is not my concern. So not to pick on South Africans, this is a reality in this country where our moral sense of responsibility ends 100 yards beyond our immediate living area. And this should not be, my dear sister, this should not be.
A great story. Reminds me of an experience I had a few years ago. I was at a conference in Cape Town, and they took us into a shanty town where a theater was located, where they had these amazing puppets. It was a puppet theater, and it was an extraordinary exhibition. And they took us from there to the brand new, not quite opened yet, but we got an advance tour of the African Museum of Modern Art. And these art forms here were just extraordinary. It reminds me of your experience there with the mall and the shanty town. We've got a question queued up here for Patrick, from Patrick Mason, a friend of ours at Utah State University, who's a chair of Mormon studies there. Do we have Patrick ready to go?
Hi, Professor Jennings. Hope you can hear me.
I can, Dr. Mason. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So in your research for your book, one of the concepts from history that I find fascinating and useful is the concept that C. Van Woodward developed in his book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, this idea of forgotten alternatives, right? That there were moments in the past that actually people in the past did find some creative alternatives. Things didn't have to turn out the way that they did. And that part of the work of the historian is to go back and remember and recover these forgotten alternatives, and they expand the horizon of possibility for us now as we move forward. So when you think about these pasts that you researched, can you think of any figures, any moments of forgotten alternatives where things could have turned out differently had we made different choices?
That's a great question. And I have been living with that question, Dr. Mason, for many years. And in point of fact, I mean, this has been one of my plea to all my historian friends and all those who are training soon to be historians. What we are in desperate need of are the stories of those missionaries, especially, who tried to go a different way. In my next book, I'm working on the doctrine of creation. And what I'm trying to do is to discern the two paths of missionaries. The one path that is already described in the Christian imagination is the missionary who places herself or himself squarely between the merchant and the soldier, and they operate in concert. But then there is the other missionary, the missionary who chooses to join, as I like to say. They become one with the people that they that they have been called to serve. The problem is, Dr. Mason, as you know, these people were often destroyed. That is to say, they were excommunicated, they were pulled back from the mission field, they were left on the mission field, their journals, their papers, their reports back home were burned, destroyed. And so to try to get our hands on those people and their stories, that's the work I'm desperately hoping more historians will take on. The ones who tried to go an alternative path. Well, part of my goal in putting the great Bishop Colonizer in the book was to announce a little bit of that. Because as you know, by the end of his life, by the end of his career there, where he began as fully inside the work of colonization, fully inside the colonial work of turning, assimilating the Zulu people. By the time he realized what was happening, he took all the tools that he had created for assimilation, for resistance. And so he was one who was already making that turn. And of course, and as I'm noting in the book, he suffered so much. His very best friend, Shepstone, abandoned him. And their friendship ended. And the melancholy and the sadness of that loss, you feel through the pages of his work. But here's the thing about it. What we know, and this is why I always want to remind people, we know that a different Christianity was possible. We know that an alternative vision of how to be Christian in the new world was possible. And why it wasn't chosen was because what was shown to be possible was far more persuasive than the other, which gives us the lesson that historians teach us, right? And that is, it is those possibilities that are not taken because they are seen as less compelling for the kind of life we imagine we want to live. But in my next book, I'm not going to give away too much. In my next book, I do have a few examples of some people who are starting to turn in a different direction. But in my next book, what I'm showing is that the incredible pain that they accept in saying, we will go this direction.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question, though.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings, and thank you for a little intro into your new book. Yeah, I'm intrigued. Yeah, you can say as much about that as you want. Yeah. I have another question, and it is from someone who kind of touched my heart a bit. Her name is, she's calling herself Sister Lawrence, and this is how she begins. I hope this is not an ignorant question. First, thank you so much for the lecture this morning. I was particularly struck by your coming back several times to what seems to me to be the now damaged relationship of displaced groups of people, especially BIPOC people, with the land, nature, and the environment. What, or is there something that someone like me, not displaced, white, middle class, Christian, could do to make any difference in that particular issue? Mr. Lawrence.
That's a great question, and it's not a bad question at all. It's a wonderful question. Well, my plea for everyone, but especially for people of European descent who have been designated inside this long history of being white, my plea is to start to become better storytellers. As I like to say, and I think it's very important I want everybody to make sure they hear this. One of the great tragedies of Christians is that we have failed to be the kind of storytellers God wants us to be. We have been poor storytellers, which means that we have failed to offer people rich ways in which to situate their lives inside story. And so what are the stories that we must tell? Again, I outlined them in the lecture. The story of Gentile inclusion, the story of entering into another people's story, and the life of humility and joining that is supposed to be shaped by constantly remembering the entering in. And one of the classes I teach, I start the students, a class on race, I start the students with a slow meditation and reading over several weeks and reflecting over the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. Ruth coming with Naomi to people who are not her own, that she makes her own. And this is the journey of the Gentile, but it's also the journey of the Christian. So that story And then the story of race, the very formation of it is a story we need to tell. But as she mentioned in this wonderful question, to learn the story of the land, just to learn the story of the land. I wish for every Christian should be deeply knowledgeable about the places where they live. You know, many institutions now, as many of you know, they start every event, and I know in Canada this is pretty common now. They start every event with a land acknowledgement. It's a small thing, but it's an important thing. So here, where I am, we are in the land, and in our events we are in the land of the Algonquin-speaking people. I live on the land. I live in Hamden, Connecticut. I live on the land of the Quinnipiac people, and by me saying that starts to orient my life and my thankfulness for being on the land that yet is their land. It is, as the word goes, is unceded land. And so what I would say to this dear sister is that we must become better storytellers, and then start to ask ourselves, if these are the stories we're inside of, how should we live?
We have a question here from Sam Jacob. Do we need to get Sam queued up? Sam is the Humanities Center undergraduate intern and is graduate school bound. Sam, are you there?
My question relates to what you've been discussing just about this essential connection to land and space and place. Given the problematic nature of ownership and possessiveness of land and space outside of that thoughtfulness, that connectivity that you just described to place and space, is the pathway out of those problematic attitudes of possessiveness and ownership a strictly theological pathway, or are those theological pathways that you describe in the most detail, are those essential to join up with, for instance, join together with pathways that relate to politics and governmental administration, or even other forms of art and, like you say, storytelling? Could you talk a little bit more about pathways and the way in which the theological pathway intersects with those other pathways out of those attitudes?
Sam, great question. Yes, absolutely. In fact, we don't want to understand it as separate pathways. We want to see them as joined, if you will, deeply intertwined. So to learn the history of a place is already to put you inside all the ways in which that place has come to be, that is the built environment. Puts you inside the political reality of it, the economic reality, the racial reality of it, the social reality of it. Puts you inside the tears of the place, where and the blood that has been spilled on the ground. It puts you inside all of that in order to start to think about this crucial question, Sam: how must we live together? You see, the problem we're facing is that because we are inside the logics and the sensibility, and in a sense the spirituality of private property, the way to think the communal at the site of geography, at the site of life together, is sorely lacking for everyone. And so it's a call to Christians to help facilitate a conversation that needs to happen. I was giving a lecture this was maybe 3 years ago now. Oh, actually, maybe 5 years ago. I'm getting older now. 5 years ago, in a city, and I was talking about these matters, and a young man who was a partner in an architectural firm came up to me, and we were at a reception at someone's home, and he wanted to pull me to the side to talk to me. So he pulled me to the side, and he started crying. He started weeping and saying, I've heard what you said to me, and I know that in the firm I work, we make decisions in terms of the way we design neighborhoods and design buildings and design communities that builds upon the racial antagonism, the racial separation of the city. We enhance it on purpose by the way we design, because we're driven by the bottom line. And he said, and as a Christian, I don't know what to do. And I said to him, what you must do is join up with other Christians, Christians in real estate, other architects, Christians in city planning, Christians in development, and get together and pray together and say, what does our faith demand of us as we think about this incredible power we have to shape a community, and through that, to shape a city. But yes, I definitely think it has to come together. Sam, the challenge is the courage to do this. Because as this young man said to me, he's in a firm that the firm did not hire him to think those thoughts. The firm hired him to create buildings and neighborhoods that align with the bottom line. And so it would require courage to offer a different possibility. So are you heading on to architectural school? Okay, it's wonderful.
No, graduate school in English.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. All right, good. Well, hey, listen, that's close enough. Thank you for your question, Sam.
We have, for Dr. Jennings, another question, and this is a professor from our college, the Family and Social Sciences. And this is Rebecca Schweinitz. And this is the question. One of my classes talked recently about parts of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited.
Beautiful book.
I'm wondering how you see your work engaging with, building on, and challenging perhaps, extending some of his theological groundwork.
It's
Thank you,
beautiful
Rebecca.
question. I am a great lover of Howard Thurman, and the doctor picked up nicely some of the inspiration and influence there. Thurman had such an expansive vision of a beloved community, and I certainly share that. He did not imagine that the kind of Christianity that he had been given, which was a Christianity, deeply affected by white Christianity, that kind of Christianity was expansive enough, was flexible enough, was imaginative enough to help to envision the kind of beloved community that he thought was necessary. And for me, that's a sadness of the legacy of the Christianity we stand in, that for so many people who want a beloved community, who want a rich, deep sense of belonging that actually hits the ground, actually hits the world, actually shapes social imagination, they look at Christianity and they are sorely disappointed. So in many ways, I am in part wanting to say to Howard Thurman, to the saint among us, that dear Father Thurman, if you could see, if you were here with me, I would hope that you would say, you're moving in the direction I want to move into, and the direction I wanted so many to move toward.
That's beautiful. I just parenthetically heard a talk at AAR the other morning about Howard Thurman, a beautiful talk about how Thurman would talk to trees.
Yeah.
It's inclusive of the natural world as well as of the peoples.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful talk. Got a question coming to us now from George Handley, speaking of ecology, one of our great environmental humanists here at the BYU. George, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Dr. Jennings. It's been a thrill to read your book, and I'm looking forward to next week as well. I am a post-colonial literature person who happens to have made a conversion to ecotheology. So your book made a lot of connections for me that I've been looking for, actually. I was just really excited to see a lot of what was going on there. I guess my question sort of evolved a little bit since I first posed it on the Q&A here, because you've answered some of it, but it seems to me that your discussion has outlined differentiated relationships to land based on, right, what your ancestral history is. And maybe if you're, say, an African American, your relationship to land is going to be shaped by the history of slavery, and maybe the landscape is a sign of exile or a sign of exploitation, rather than this, welcoming home sign that, or welcome to your property sign that you were kind of describing earlier. So it seems like settler populations have a unique struggle that you've already discussed a little bit, that's quite different from say an African American struggle to recover that intimacy with the land. So I'm wondering what is essentially different in your mind, or is there a difference between and I study Caribbean literature as well as African American literature, so I've seen a lot of this similar kind of struggle in a lot of Caribbean writers, where their relationship to the land feels more like a Gentile entry back into the house of Israel than it does like this really easy claim to place. Whereas where I live right now in Utah, it seems like for settler populations like the Mormon population here, the connection to the land is very easy, it's very immediate, but it's very possessive, and it struggles to sort of account for, so it doesn't feel like a Gentile entry. So what can these different populations learn from each other about how to recover that relationship to the land? You've addressed some of that already, so I don't want you to have to rehearse some of that, but I'm just wondering if there are other dimensions of specifically, I guess my question would be, is it would it be valuable for the broader community interests if we all learned from that experience of exile, if we all learned from that re-entry into the landscape in a way that's more willing to acknowledge our alienation, our previous exile, maybe our tentativeness. I just struggle to understand how to communicate that to people who want to jump on board with, an environmental ethos, but they don't understand the sort of cross-cultural tensions that make connection to land problematic, but even if it's still very, very necessary.
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you so much, Dr. Hanley. And of course, as you said, not to repeat myself, but the one crucial missing element very often, and I even hesitate to call it an element, the crucial missing people in the room are so many indigenous people. And one of the challenges that I always like to leave when I go places is to ask, are there efforts, are there real efforts to connect with the indigenous peoples of the land in this area, who must become not only conversation partners, but become teachers to help so many people come to understand not just simply the history of the land, but who the land is. And I put it exactly that way, who the land is. That is to bring people into that different vision of the land no longer as a thing that I possess, that I really love, that I really, enjoy looking at, but the land as that which addresses me. Theologically, the way I like to put it is that, and I gained this from so many indigenous thinkers, what if we saw the land as our siblings, who together with us orient us toward the true worship of the God that has created us, so that orientation requires not simply us by ourselves. It requires so many indigenous peoples to remind us not only of the Trail of Tears, but how to rightfully look and respect your siblings. This is a crucial element, right? Now, of course, the problem is that we are shaped inside what one cultural anthropologist, Felipe Descola, calls a certain kind of naturalism that shuns that way of thinking about the world as living and animate. And so because of that, we tend to, even with our best desires, we simply double down on the kind of possessive logic of a thing that I own and love. I mean, we domesticate the world into all of it being our pet. But now let me back up a little bit to the earlier part of your question, which I think is important. So for so many displaced people of African descent, one of the realities of struggle is precisely with struggling with this way of connecting to land. And there, as you mentioned, their ambiguous relationship with it, because for many of them, they sense that this is a possessive logic that, in point of fact, offers no deep spiritual connection. It's really just a possessive logic. But what also has to be remembered alongside that kind of ambiguous consideration and holding on to the land, there is a long history. And I think of my own parents who tapped into one of the great spiritual realities of being a creature. And that is the land heals, the dirt heals. If you ever saw that movie Fences that was recently done, one of the interesting things about that movie Fences, it was based on Augustus Wilson's beautiful play, is that the opening scene says so much. The two of the main characters get off the trash truck that they were working on. They take their lunch pails, they go into the house, grab something to drink, and then they go straight out into the backyard and sit in their chairs. For so many Black folks, being connected to that safe little garden, that safe little space in the back of your house or in the side of your house or the space between apartments becomes a healing space. And so that's tapping into a reality we want to keep in mind, that there is something profoundly healing about touching the dirt, about hearing the birds, about seeing the trees. We're not talking about a romanticism. We're talking about a recalibration to home, to our creatureliness. That's always been so crucial. And sometimes even with that sentimentality that we talked about earlier, that's tied to possessive logics, there is an element that reaches all the way to that proper relation. That is, it reaches all the way to the recognition that there is something homing, something settling, something centering about me and this world that I have got to honor, but I have to honor it in a way that will pull away this possessive incrustation that teaches me that I can only do that if I own it. This is one of the great problems with the history of conservation, as we know, that the history of conservation, while on the one hand, it's a beautiful thing that many lands were spared from the development's rape, that history of conservation also destroyed, excluded, pushed out untold thousands of indigenous peoples from those very lands, saying to them, even though this is the land that possesses you, we could care less because now we possess it for the sake of everyone else. And it's that tragic history that we have not really thought enough about.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, George. It's good to see you. Thank you for that question. And And really, Dr. Jennings, I loved when you talked about your mother Mary in the book and her connection with the earth. It made me think of my grandmother and tending to her garden. You write like a screenwriter or a playwright, and it's so visual for me, and I love that. Maybe you can create a film or play with your books, because that would be awesome.
I will aim for that, my dear sister. I will aim for that.
Okay, because you can do it. All right, I have another question from Gideon Bates. And he wants to know, Dr. Jennings, this morning you talked about how Christianity influenced the European settlers and their interactions with the native people in America. A lot of what you said, oh, that just moved because someone just added, hold on.
Right here, do you see it?
I don't see it anymore.
Okay, let me ask the question here. Let me start over from the top here.
Okay.
Dr. Jennings, this morning you talked about how Christianity influenced the European settlers and their interactions with the native people in America. A lot of what you said is comparable to the later history with the American Colonization Society. So how does the history of the American Colonization Society and even Liberia go along with the ideas you've brought up?
Oh, I think that's a wonderful question.
Yeah.
We always have to remember that the process of colonization, as I mentioned, was a evaluative process that invited so many indigenous peoples and so many enslaved peoples to internalize this evaluative process. So in order to not only see what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful, but also to create what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. That being said, it's completely understandable that those formerly enslaved peoples, in imagining what they should do if they return to Africa, though many of them, had not been born in Africa, but if they return to Africa, they imagine themselves as, in a fundamental way, more benign, more kind colonizers. They too would be about the work of civilizing the indigenous. They too would be about the work of Christianizing. They too would be about the work of building the new society that in many cases, as we know, structurally, in terms of the buildings, in terms of the homes, mirrored the plantation. But the lesson, one of the lessons that must be learned from this is the way in which the built environment always signals precisely the vision of who you imagine yourself to be and who you imagine people to become, who they should become. Yeah.
Thank you. Got a question here from my colleague in the English department, Sharon Harris. She asks, I think this is a very fine question. She says, I'm loving this book and these discussions. Thank you. My sense from your book is that the colonization of the New World and the perceived glut of property to be gained there gave rise to this distortion and displacement of the Christian story. Was there anything in Christian thinking prior to this that primed European Christian settlers to respond this way? More pointedly, was there anything besides supersessionism that did this, and or how were key elements of supersessionism baked into settler mentalities as they came to the New World?
Oh, great questions. Well, let me start with the first part of it. There were already antecedents happening in the old world in the way in which Christians understood the relationship to Islam, to Muslims, and to a group of people loosely identified historically as Moors. And depending on which historian you talk about, who the Moors actually were, it's a very loose definition. But it certainly was, at one level, darker-skinned Arabs, but at another level, anyone seen as outside the Christian story, either by disposition, by theology, or by behavior. And so imagining how one treats those outside was already baked into the Christian way of imagining relationships and relationality based on the old world when they got to the new world. And so what that meant was the question of the possibility of salvation, excuse me, the depth at which these indigenous peoples could actually be saved and become Christian was calibrated, very calibrated by what they understood was possible for those in the old world outside of Christianity, the converted Muslim, the converted Jew, the Moor. So the extent to which they had to be watched to see if they're really Christian also shaped the way in which they saw the possibilities. Now, what did that mean? It meant that, as I talked about in the lecture, they may become Christian, but whether they could ever really rise to the level of leader in the Christian church, well, that's a different matter. We're not sure about that. We'll just have to keep watching them. They have to be eternally, perpetually, if you will, watch and forever be student to the teachers, because we're not sure about the possibility of their Christianity. But what's also the case, and here we want to understand that supersessionism has, in a sense, many tentacles. The one tentacle, I really laid out in the displacement was the way in which it centered the European inside God's actions in terms of God's actions in the world. That God, in order to do what God needed to get done in the world, needed the Christian. The Christian was absolutely crucial, because outside the Christian, God is not doing anything. But another crucial aspect of that supersessionism is the incredible discomfort with not being in control, the impossibility of even understanding authentic Christianity if it does not involve not just Christians, but these particular Christians, later on we would call European, being in the position of control. And this too was a crucial element of that supersessionist logic. Not to mention, let me just say a little about what that meant for the Bible. And here we remain inheritors of this. It is yet a memo that most Christians have not received, that the Bible is not first theirs. That is such new news to many Christians. They believe that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament scriptures, their story. They believe that when Jesus is speaking to the crowds, that and his disciples are all around him, they believe that that's them. Some would be utterly shocked to know that no, these are Jewish people. Now, of course, the thing I always used to say to my students, which helps to underscore this, is I said, if you were in the time of Jesus and you walked up to Jesus, hoping to talk to him, what you would see is his back, because he would not be talking to you. He would be talking to his people. And if you got his attention, he would glance at you and then glance back at his people and keep on talking, because he wasn't talking to you. The only people who caught his eye were the people who came in front of him and acted as though they were a part of his people. That's key.
I love that. We have a question from Morgan Davis, who would like to ask live. Is he queued, Adam?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Davis, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Let's see if I can see my question now. Where'd it go? Well, I'll just riff on it. It's really a version of kind of what George Handley asked a few minutes ago. I couched it in really kind of personal terms. I'm a native Utahn, and yet feel, when I contemplate sort of the challenge of connecting to this place and allowing it to possess me. And I spend a lot of time in these mountains and on these trails. I feel a deep sense of connection and healing. It's a source of, mental health for me. But when I think about the fact that I am, the descendant of settlers here who possessed this land in a very real sense illegitimately, I feel stuck. I feel like the only option I have to achieve a real deep sense of legitimate belonging and being claimed by this place would be to achieve some kind of relationship to the first peoples here that I don't know how to even go about doing that. They've become so invisible because they've been driven away and scattered. How do we even begin to approach something like that on a personal basis? If that might be some kind of approach, but really to achieve real healing, real recuperation, it would need to be much larger than that. Even a conversation with the native peoples of this place. And I feel like the problem isn't just that we ignore it, it's that we don't even see it. We don't even see that problem. And I have to acknowledge the incredible service that you've done in writing this book so sensitively and raising to the level of our awareness these kinds of very subtle blockages. And being stuck in historical circumstances that really seem to have no easy solutions, and maybe not even difficult solutions. They're just really intractable.
Dr. Davis, thank you so much for that. I take your question, your comment to be beautifully rhetorical in many ways. There is, Dr. Underwood mentioned this in his opening comments for my lecture, and then I mentioned the same text in my lecture. That Ephesians 2 text is so rich for us, because the Ephesians 2 text has that crucial word that's aimed at we Gentiles. It says, "You Gentiles, remember." And it is the writer inviting Gentiles into the same pedagogy of Israel, of the ongoing, necessary, crucial work of remembering. You must remember. You must. Remembering is not a one-time thing. It is a way of life. You remember. And so the challenge for us is that we've inherited a Christianity that has strangled remembering. It has reduced it to almost nothing. And a broad vision of remembering would, as you just were saying, it would, of course, turn us to the indigenous peoples of this land. It would place as a crucial intellectual work of unearthing their stories, unearthing their ideas, finding where they have been scattered, sending out the clarion call, all those who called this place home, come speak to us, come help us. And it would require the deep spiritual discipline to yield our hearts and minds to what they would say, to help us understand how to shift from possession of to possession by, to help us rethink what it means to live in honor and peace and respect of the land and respect of those who called it home. And now, of course, I say this not to avoid the obvious political, social, economic implications of doing that, but it's to situate our moral imaginations inside the biblical command to remember, to remember. That's what's key. We are overwhelmed when we think at this moment in our histories about the layers of processes of exchange upon which we stand as land owners and possessors of land. Not realizing that the work of remembering slices down through all those layers of exchange to the very earth itself and opens up the possibility for someone to say, many, many years ago, my people hunted the caribou right here. Where this water is where my people are from. And in many places, it's as simple, Dr. Davis, it's as simple as getting indigenous people to tell you what the actual name of the place was. Because as you know, in the history of this country, one of the most profound and deadly gestures of colonialism was to deny indigenous names for places. And in many cases, under penalty of punishment, imprisonment, or death, would happen if people called it by that indigenous name. It is not that, it is this. And so just to remember the names. What is that mountain? Who is that mountain? That is an act of remembering that can heal the soul. It can heal. But we have to agree that the biblical command to remember, we will now hear.
Amen.
One little follow-up here from Rebecca de Schweinitz. It's a fragment of a question, not a question she says, but she's thinking about Morgan's question and how to address this kind of thing on an institutional level. She's thinking about church history sites, for example, that we have, and what can an institution like BYU do about this kind of problem?
Great question. And as I was saying to Dr. Davis, here's the thing about it. BYU is like every institution, every university is filled with investigators who can do this with one hand tied behind their back. The ones who can do the historical work, the ones that can do the genealogical work, the ones that can locate the indigenous peoples, the one that can do the typography, the ones that can find out the names. I mean, you unleash the community of scholars into the work of remembering. And so a simple first step, who were the indigenous peoples and where are they? Who are the ones who yet tell the stories? Where are they? Can we bring them to campus? Are they here in the community? And we've figured out how to hide from them. Who knows the stories? That's a simple but an important first step. And then, but now here's the crucial matter. How do we embed this work of remembering in the curriculum? That's the question. How do we embed it? How do we embed learning the land as a part of learning anything that you're going to be doing in this university? Learning the land. And now let's press even further. Learning to listen to the land. Learning to hear earth and sky, tree and animal. Learning to sense the dirt. How do we embed that into the educational goals of what it means to be well educated at this wonderful institution?
Thank you. We have a question here from, if we can get her on, Laura Howe. Is Laura, Adam, can we get Laura Howe on?
Hi. I think I'm here. Hi, I am an art curator. I'm the curator at the Church History Museum in Salt Lake City. So a connected institution. And I'm loving this, especially philosophically, the idea of remembering and remembering the names, and that's really sinking into me. And I'm trying to think practically. And the other part that really spoke to me about practically how I can do what I do better is being a better storyteller, really sunk into me as well. I'm trying to think practically, your idea that really is insightful to me that I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around, and I'd love your thoughts, is how we join together. You talk about bringing architects and artists and politicians and everyone together to imagine a future. And I'm trying to think of what that means in terms of place, because I'm part of lots of places, and the bigger I think, the harder that task seems. But the smaller I think, the more exclusionary it seems, right? What might be good for my city-bound community excludes the perspectives of those on a different side of the city, if that makes sense. Or if I think about my place, all of the borders that I put in trying to think about that seem to draw lines. So how practically do you define place when it comes to trying to imagine a bigger future? Ideally, it should be on a world basis, but then we don't get down to specific, I guess.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. That's a great question. So what I always tell people is that in every community, there is this monthly, sometimes bi-monthly meeting. They're called city commissioners, other things, where this group of people gather, and it's normally a meeting that's televised on local public access TV. And when you look on the audience, there's like 3 people there. And these city commissioners, or whatever they're called in various communities, they get reports, they get requests for what's going to happen in the community, what bus lines are going to go, what new developments are going to happen, price points for those developments, where sidewalks will go. They do zoning policy. That is the community I want people to think about first. That community that is, in a sense, made the responsibility of those commissioners and anybody comes to it. Now, here's the thing, Dr. Hall, that's really crucial. Those meetings normally are poorly attended. And those are the most important moral and ethical meetings that happen in any community. More moral and ethical than voting, more moral and ethical than doing anything else. Why? Because those meetings are where people decide the shape of their community. They decide this housing project this housing development is going to go up, and the starting price is going to be $780,000 for a house. Okay, who made that decision? Who's going to be excluded by that? This bus line is going to happen, but it's not going to go to these neighborhoods. Well, who made that decision? And who's going to be excluded by that? This school is going to go over here, but it's not going to have these programs. Those programs will be at this school over there that we're going to build. Well, who made that decision, and who's going to be? This is the place where a moral compass is needed. And rarely is there a moral compass there. Let me also just say, honestly, not to demonize anyone, but often decisions are made in back rooms with developers and real estate and other people that those decisions don't want to be brought out into the light until they're a done deal. And it's unfortunate. And so the first point of responsibility is to that meeting and the community that those people are in charge of. That's the one. Now, sometimes that's a particular area of a community, of a city. Sometimes it's a larger area, but that's the first thing I want people to get their minds around, that meeting and what those people are deciding. Then there's the other, right? So I tell people who are going to be ministers and they're called to a church, what I tell them is, in the first 2 years of your time, I need you to get a good pair of shoes and I need you to walk your community. I need you to walk a 5-mile radius over 2 years. It takes a long time to walk a 5 mile, but I want you to walk a 5-mile radius. And I want you to go and I want you to open your ears. And I want you not to, say hello to people and introduce yourself, but your task is to listen. I need for you to listen to what the community sounds like. What do the people sound like? What do the neighborhoods sound like? What do the cars sound like? What birds are there? What animals are there? What trees are there? Your goal is to come to the point where you can sense your community. So I ought to be able to come to you and say, when is your community happy? When is your community sad? When is your community tired? When is your community excited? And you ought to look at me, not with a strange look like, what? You ought to look at me and say, oh, I can tell you, it happened, because I'm sensing my community. Now, with that knowledge in place, you will never have to ask me or anyone else, what should you be doing? Because you will know, oh, there's a development going up over here, or over here, there's a lot of tension over here. Over here, I noticed that bus routes don't reach here, and the trash pickup is pretty irregular. What's going on over here? Why is that the case? What one should be doing will arise out of how one comes to understand and sense the place, rather than simply, rushing in like a hero and say, oh, we're going to fix this up, without having ever listened to those who inhabit the place. That's what's necessary. That's where we start. And if we start there, then we'll work out into wider and wider circles. We'll finally work out to the full reality of the city, and even beyond that, to the state and to the region, because we'll now start to understand. What happened in Flint, Michigan happened because many people didn't have the knowledge I just explained to you. But had people been going to those meetings, and had people had a sense of how the community feels, the minute bad water starts pouring, they would have known it and said, oh, this can't be. Oh no. Do you smell that? What is that? What is that we smell? Thank you for your great, great question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Again, you always connect with me because we adopted our boys and they were born in Flint, Michigan. So, wow. Grant, but we have one more question that I think would be great to end on, unless you want to hold off due to time, but it's really great.
Let's take the
People are
question.
loving you and loving this, Dr. Jennings, and we won't be able to get to all the questions, but wow, this is amazing.
Let's take that last question for this session, knowing there are many more for the next one.
Yes, thank you. So yes, hold on. Okay, so here it is, and it's from Charles Swift, and it's so good. And then he asks, we Christians have a poor record of sometimes giving God the credit for our bad ideas, often due to our misinterpretation of the scriptural text. Centuries of racial bigotry and slavery come to mind as examples. If there were only one change you could suggest that we flawed humans could implement to break this pattern of thinking our bad ideas come from heaven, what would it be? Praise the Lord.
Wow, that's a profound question. One
Thank
idea
you.
to break this this idea. Well, I would say the one thing that I know always helps breaking bad ideas is to center our attention as clearly as we can on the life of Jesus. One of the things we theologians love to remind people of is that the life of Jesus not only is saving, not only is salvific, but it is also clarifying. And what I mean by that is that the life of Jesus helps to undermine, helps to destroy the fantasies about what God should be, what a God should be. And so many people who are Christian, people who are not Christian, they live with the fantasy of God and not the reality of God revealed in Jesus. And so one of the challenges is to help Christians calibrate what God is saying, what God would say, what God has said by the life of Jesus, and not by our fantasies of what we think God should be, and therefore what we think God should say. I would say that's the one thing, the one, in a sense, the one starting point I would want for so many people. And what we learn when we look at the life of Jesus, we learn of a God who has given God's life, body and soul, for the sake of the creation, that, as Charles Wesley said, that God has never ceased to love, that God refuses to stop loving this creation. And, that is an excellent place to start thinking about God, not thinking God's power and coming and then thinking God's love, but thinking God's love as the basis of understanding God's power. That's where I would want to start.
Amen.
Amen.
Gosh.
Amen. What a wonderful session, and what a great note to end on. Here at BYU, we so strive for blending faith and intellect, and you've been such a great model of that, such a gracious interlocutor, and thank you so much. It's not over yet, folks. We've got another session in just another half hour. But thank you so much for this time. And thank to you, the audience. What a great set of questions. I think, Professor Jennings, you can tell we have a tremendous set of associates and community members here. We value them. Thank you for being here, audience. And thank you, Professor Jennings. And thanks to Lita and Matt for so deftly fielding the flow of questions and directing traffic. Wonderful. Thanks to all of you. We'll see many of you in a half an hour. Good afternoon, and welcome to our second session with Professor Willie Jennings from Yale University. We are exploring his book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. Professor Jennings, it is a delight to have you here with us. For those that may be joining us for the first time, Professor Jennings, I hope you've seen our website, our publicity. He is a renowned academic. This particular book has won top prizes in the academic world. Once you get into the book yourselves, as many of you have, and that's why you're here at this session, you'll recognize its brilliance, its insightfulness, and its eloquence. You should know that Professor Jennings, it won't surprise you, is also a bit of a poet, and he has a book of poetry in the works. He's also a real citizen of our nation and one who reaches out to the people in a variety of venues, community activities, universities. He'll speak in a variety of settings to carry his message and his insights to all people. It won't surprise you that you'll see him lots on YouTube. He's been invited to many different universities and places in our country. And we are very fortunate to have you here, sir. This is a real treat. Again, for those that are joining us, we've had tremendous experiences thus far, a powerful overview lecture this morning, a stimulating first workshop session, and we look forward to this being the same. If you're new to us, these are Q&A times. So questions have been submitted in advance, but we welcome your particular questions this afternoon in this session. You can submit them on the Q&A line, and we have, helping us facilitate the flow of questions, we have here first Lita Giddens, who is the manager coordinator of the Diversity in Collaboration and Inclusion Initiative out of the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences, and also serves on the university's Race, Equity, and Belonging Committee. These are important entities that are moving us forward in this important engagement. Also, we have Professor Matt Wickman, Professor of English, and the founding director of our BYU Humanities Center. These two friends and very capable individuals will be our kind of question facilitators and moderators. And with that, I would like to turn the time over, as we like to say here, to Lita to get us launched.
Thank you. It really has been a blessing and a gift to be involved in this event with Dr. Jennings. And this first workshop, our first workshop, was so wonderful. I feel like I'm a child in a candy shop, a spiritual candy shop. But people are loving this and loving you, Dr. Jennings. And we have had a request before we begin this second workshop, if you would summarize for us, again, the main points of our first workshop before we continue on with this one, Dr. Jennings.
Be glad to. And let me again thank Dr. Underwood and all the sectors of the university for this very gracious offer and invitation for me to come, and to thank you, Dr. Giddens and Dr. Whitman, for leading this workshop so beautifully with these wonderful questions. Well, in this time that we've had together in this workshop, we have been exploring the first chapters of the Christian imagination. And we have been looking at questions. I've been receiving questions that really focused in on some of the crucial matters in those first chapters. And so I would probably characterize it with three kinds of questions we've received. We've received questions about the relationship of Christians to the land. And there, we've talked about, as I mentioned in my lecture and as I mentioned in the book, the deep connection between race and place, the deep connection between the way race comes to be inside the designations of people within racial categories, and at the same time, the stripping from people place-centered identities, where so many peoples understood who they were as deeply connected to place, to land and animals, landscape, seasons, that was a part of the fabric of their identity. And as I said, race in many ways comes to be precisely in that stripping and that designation. The second matter that we spent time discussing had to do with what I term in the book one of the great mistakes of Christianity, a mistake that germinated and created tremendous problems. And that is the way in which Christians very early started to imagine themselves as the people of God, replacing, supplanting, pushing to the side Israel as the people of God, and imagining ourselves as the center of God's attention, we Gentile Christians, that anything God does in the world, God does through us. And so we, in that long history of pushing Israel to the margins, we forgot our own story. And so many people, their Christianity formed without a sense of this story. And what story is that? It is the story of Gentile inclusion, that we were brought in, brought in to the story of another people. And it is that act of being brought in and the humility and the sense of what that means for how one is a Christian and lives the Christian life that so many have no sense of. It's like there's a missing enzyme in us that creates a cascade of problems. And then the third thing many people asked me about, and what we discussed, was really what I call the problems around assimilation, the problems around of how to be Christian in the world today, given the kinds of segregationist mentalities, the kind of segregationist ways of thinking about life that we are all inculcated in. The inability to think ourselves in deep ways of connecting and entering into place and the peoples of place. And so we had wonderful conversation, I think, around these three matters. And there were other things that fit in between them, but I think those highlight some of the crucial matters for us. And so as we now turn to the second half of the Christian imagination, we build on some of these themes, but we also add some of the other matters that we talked about in the lecture, matters of translation and the implication for that. And of course, that big word I end the last sections of the book with: intimacy. What does it mean for Christians to give witness to the kind of intimate life together that God desires for us?
It's a beautiful vision, Willie, and you're extremely eloquent in expounding it. I've got a question. So, work here at BYU, Religious University. I'm, like most here, I'm a religious person. I also work in a mostly secular field, English, sort of literature. And I have learned over many years what my field can bring to my faith. I'm always interested, though, in what matters of faith, belief, religion, philosophy, et cetera, can bring to these fields. And that's the kind of question I want to ask you here, is to kind of get into the second part of our conversation today. I'm thinking about a book I read years ago, a really great book of post-colonial theory. It was Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe. Yes. Right? Great book. And in there, he makes some moves that are similar to yours. Talks about kind of the abstractionist impulse in the Enlightenment and how that has a kind of an effect, an oppressive effect on how how Europe kind of colonizes the globe by creating universals that apply to all peoples. And his way of combating that is to go back to the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, to kind of rethink our being. And it's a very powerful book, but I'm really struck that your book makes a theological move. Mm-hmm. So my question is, what difference does theology make?
Yeah, that's a great question. What difference? And I thought there was going to be a few more words you were about to say after the theology make.
And I could, but the point is being, the point I could go on if you want, but I talk too much is my problem. The question was just, given that in his case, Heidegger is the great solution, right? Returning to Heidegger, reflection on being, asking different questions that de-universalize. It's a secular answer. It's a secular solution he provides. Right. And what you're doing is you're also running through sort of issues of abstraction, displacement, right? Private property, et cetera, whiteness as a universalizing category. Yes. But your solution is not a secular one per se, it's a theological one. And so my question, which I find compelling as both an academic, but also as a religious person. So my question is, what does a theological solution provide that a secular one can't?
That's a great question. So I think in part, what a religious or theological let's rather than solution, but a vision toward the possibility of life together is that it angles toward more than what so many secularists, if you will, or non-religious people would think is enough. For many, they stop at the door of toleration. If we can, for others, they stop at the door of a more equitable reality of exchange, so that, it's equal. For others, they stop at the door of a more equal reality of opportunities. All of that is good. But what a theological vision presses toward is shared life. We're pressing inside a sharing of burden. And as I say toward the end of the Christian imagination, a sharing of need. This is one of the and my next book that I'm working on, After Creation, this is one of the things I build on from the Christian imagination, that what the colonialists did in many cases is that they tried to separate people precisely in how they pursue their needs, because the colonialists wanted to place himself or herself, but mostly himself, right at the center of how people negotiate and meet their needs in order to control the processes of exchange and so forth for financial reasons. But what is necessary is a vision of shared need in which it's not simply allowing someone to stand there in the middle and control the negotiation of need, but a sharing in need that deepens and builds toward a life together. So to answer your question, your very fine question, Dr. Whitney, I think what the theological difference is that at the end of the day, we want to deepen the sharing. What I like to say about these matters, and this comes to the heart of the problem of as I mentioned in our earlier workshop, the problem of assimilation. And the reason for so many people, the word assimilation can only mean loss. But the Christian story at its heart offers a different vision of assimilation. And so the point is, which is, I think this presses deeply into the theological difference. The point is not that you listen to me as I share my story and speak of my people and speak of their aspirations and their hopes and their longings and their needs and their history, and then to applaud politely as I share that. The point is that you learn my people's story. You learn my people's aspirations and needs and history, and that you make it a part of yourself, that you speak of the love of my people, and I in turn do the same for you. And in doing that, we're moving toward becoming one people, not through loss, but through addition, through expansion. It is the sharing of stories. And in that way, the weaving of a new story that does not deny the first story. Now, no secularist is interested in anything like that. No critical theorist, no philosopher, no sociologist. But the Christian, at the end of the day, we are inside God's desire. And God's desire is that God's own desire for us becomes, let me use an old King James word, becomes manifest in us, so that we desire one another inside the same intensity of love that God desires. Now, of course, that has political, social, economic implications, but it is deeply theological.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that shared life vision is so essential, especially now and what we're
Mhm.
experiencing. And it's
Mhm.
something that I literally pray for. I love that vision. We have a question from Keith Lawrence, who'd like to ask that live. Adam, he's queued up. Keith?
Thank you so much for being here, Professor Jennings, and thanks to Professor Giddens and Professor Wickman and Professor Underwood for hosting. This has been delightful. I realized as I was typing my question for the earlier session that it really had more to do with intimacy than it did with displacement. So I rephrased it, but I would like to return to the question that I really wanted to ask. I'm going to tell you the question first. I want to give a little bit of context so that it doesn't sound quite perhaps as disjointed as it may otherwise sound. I also want to acknowledge that I think that you have answered part of the question in the response that you just provided Professor Wickman. So you won't need to repeat that part of the response. But my central question is how you feel displacement and translation are actually compounded by intimacy or a false intimacy, and how that particular situation can be particularly addressed or overcome. And the context I want to provide is this. I grew up in a very small southern Utah community. There were 150 people on a good day. It was a Mormon community. The two nearest communities retained Indian place names of the native Paiutes that lived in the area. My grandfather had only 2 years of education, and those were both, I think they were second and third grade, but he taught himself to read and write, and he knew more about geology and history than most college professors I've encountered during my lifetime. He was amazing. He was an avid rock collector. He could identify every sample that he collected, but he could also remember years and years later exactly where he procured each sample. They were like children to him, so that there was an intimacy that was pretty amazing to the land. He also loved Native American history, and he collected, before it was illegal to do so, a lot of Native American artifacts, which he later donated to colleges. I heard a lot of stories about Native Americans growing up. The cemetery in our small community was actually an abandoned Native American cemetery, and it was respected as a sort of a point of continuation of history, and parts of the cemetery where there were Native Americans buried were respected, and whites were not buried there. But there was a kind of unified place in death that was really interesting to me, and it was part of stories that I heard growing up. So one final point, you probably know that our fundamental scripture along with the Bible is the Book of Mormon, another testament of Jesus Christ, and that book reminds white Americans repeatedly that they are Gentiles and that they are part of House of Israel by adoption, and that they have an enormous responsibility to ensure that Native peoples and peoples around the world have access to salvation. And if they don't, Christ himself in the Book of Mormon declares that Native peoples will go among the whites like young lions and destroy. Despite all of those things, I worry that, I'll speak only for myself, that my responsibility is compromised to a degree, I think, by a kind of intimacy, a false intimacy that I feel. I feel that I'm doing things that you've advised, perhaps. Then I recognize in reading your book that there are probably elements of condescension and control in my attitude, and that my attitude itself is hierarchical in a variety of problematic ways. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that issue of displacement and translation. My grandfather's stories, I would call translations. It was a white man telling me about Native Americans, but how those can potentially compound our sense of intimacy and what we do to overcome that. And I apologize, that's probably the wrong kind of context, but I wanted you to know exactly what my question was.
Well, thank you, Reverend Lawrence, for that, and thank you for sharing about your family. I always appreciate when people share in this really important and honorable way. I mean, and in part, what you said, especially toward the end of your comments, I think point in such really important and fruitful directions for responding to your question. You know, we are the inheritors. We have been bequeathed with really a damaged reality of intimacy, and as you point out so powerfully. And it gets back to something we talked about in the earlier workshop, and that is people can have profound love for, connection to the land inside of, in a fundamental way, the banishment of indigenous voice, indigenous life. So for so many people across, especially across this country, but also in Canada, I was in Canada last year talking about, for so many people, it's, you know, the legacy that they have inherited is a legacy in which those who went before them, who they love and honor, form their life, their religious life, their Christian life, without the full voice of indigenous peoples and the full reality of a life of vulnerability with and among them. And so, and as I pointed out in the lecture, what this did is that it created what I call a controlling intimacy. Right? It's a form of intimacy. Yes, it is a form of intimacy, but it has that element, more than an element, it has that viral strain of control rolling through every part of it. And so what happens is that for so many people, for so many of us shaped inside this reality, there is that gnawing reality in that many people sense that even though there is the good of intimacy, there's also something else here that isn't good, that absolutely undermines the kind of Christian witness, the kind of religious witness I want to offer, because it undermines the ongoing work of listening, the ongoing work of hearing. So as I was saying earlier to Dr. Whitman in his comment, the goal is for these sensibilities, the voice, the wisdom, the knowledge, the stories of those indigenous peoples that your grandfather and great-grandfather encountered to have been so connected to who you are that they come forward. So that what we hear, Reverend Lawrence, is that we hear a story that is more than your people. That is to say, it's a story that shows another people that is now inside of you, right? So the going forward for all of us is to ask, how might that wider story of the land and of my life in the land and the naming of the rocks and the naming of the trees and their textures, how might going forward I gain that wider sense? So, you know, I was talking to someone recently. I was born and raised in Oregon. And what this wonderful gentleman was talking to me about is that, you know, what he's trying to learn are, you know, he was a scientist, so he knew all the technical names for the trees and the rocks and the formations and the landscape. But he realized that it's crucial for him to also know the indigenous names, and the stories behind it. There's a book I love to recommend to many people. It's by a woman by the name of Kimmer. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's a fabulous book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She's an indigenous person, but also a biologist, and she tells these beautiful stories that weave together, a kind of white Western way of knowing the land with an indigenous way of knowing the land, a beautiful connection. And so I think, at least at kind of a beginning understanding of how we correct some of the tragic realities of the way we understand intimacy is to open ourselves up to the story that many of those who went before us, who we love, were not open to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A question now from another, Keith's a colleague of mine in the English department, and this is the next person asking the question, is Jason Kerr. Jason, are you with us?
And so my question has to do with logics of evaluation, which in your reading is just central to kind of the colonialist mindset, right? And I'm thinking about the kind of deeper Christian theological roots of evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
And really specifically, I'm thinking about them in terms of like the early Christian practice of heresiography,
Mm-hmm.
in which anti-Judaism and supersessionism played a really key part, right? So I'm thinking about a work like Justin Martyr's Dialogue with Truffaut the Jew, right? Which is really a work against Marcion,
Mm-hmm.
in which Justin uses this kind of hypothetical or fictional Jew
Mm-hmm.
kind of evaluate and find wanting, right, a fellow Christian, so to speak, right? And it's all about negotiating the boundaries of who gets to be Christian and who doesn't. And another place where that shows up is in the last Q&A, you were talking about these two different paths of missionaries, right? Where one path of missionary is kind of in between the merchant and the soldier, right? And then there's the other who tries to join, right? And it's the first kind of missionary gets involved in evaluating second kind of missionary, right?
Yes.
And they sort of evaluate that missionary out of existence, like in material ways, right? Where the records get destroyed, et cetera, right? And so I'd like to hear you reflect just theologically, and this is a sort of like intra-Christian thing, but it has deeply to do with how, like on a theological level, we as Christians engage with otherness and then use otherness, right? In ways of kind of policing our own little boundaries and using evaluation. And we could talk about Iberia and Mariscos and Conversos, et cetera, right? But love to hear you kind of reflect on that kind of just theological thing, because part of what's at stake is who gets to count as Christian and who doesn't, right? And we evaluate that ruthlessly among ourselves and then import that logic into colonialism.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr. This is a great question. This is one of the examined matters by those who look at early Christian thought, early Christian practice. And I was on a panel recently at our usual professional meeting, the American Academy of Religion, and I was with a bunch of people who do a New Testament scholarship and other things. And this is one of the I wouldn't call it a mystery in the full sense of the word, but it makes you scratch your head. And that is, in many of the founding conversations, the founding documents that show us those conversations that form orthodoxy, the commitment to the full divinity of Jesus, the commitment to the triune identity, the commitment to the divinity of the Holy Spirit. What you find in many of these documents, those documents and documents before them, you find these oftentimes gratuitous, out of the blue, profoundly anti-Semitic statements. Like, what? Why are you even saying this? I mean, what's this got to do with what you do? It's like, and what on this panel there were a couple of Jewish scholars, and we speculated about this a bit. What is it that that required in order for Christians to imagine themselves with integrity, that they needed to banish Israel? And that becomes a flavor that starts to permeate the important conversations about who God is. Now, so I ventured an idea at the panel, and in part you can see it in the book. there was a point. We don't know, we can't pinpoint it exactly historically, but there was a point at somewhere, the way I like to put it simply, where Christians got tired of hearing the story. You were included in our story. You are entering into our world. That is Israel, Jewish people saying to Gentiles, we're letting you in. God is forming us one people, but this is our story. There's a point at which Christians got really tired of that. I'm sick of hearing this. I'm sick of hearing. And in some ways, what you see in those documents, what you see forming is let's call it a deep spiritual and intellectual impatience with the story of Gentile inclusion. That starts to permeate like bad smoke all the other thinking they're trying to do about who God is. And so it grows inside of it, right? Now, I'm not one of those, there's a whole, as you know, there's a whole group of intellectuals, a whole group of historians that want to say, okay, well, this and that is this bad smoke, as you call it, Dr. Jennings, and these doctrinal formulations and the idea of orthodoxy and so forth, they're the same thing. I don't see it that way. What I see is that this is here and it has an effect on this, but it doesn't create this. It doesn't create the question of orthodoxy or heterodoxy. It has a bad effect on it. What is that bad effect? There's a brutality forming. We can see that. There's a meanness. There's something forming there that already feels exaggerated, and it grows in that exaggeration, right? So that there's a point at which Israel becomes an enemy, like someone who doesn't believe in the full divinity of Jesus is an enemy. And this is bad. And so what forms by the time we get to the medieval, what we call the medieval period, and as you know, the deep waters of colonialism, something has already hardened. Something has already hardened. Now, in my thinking, the way to unravel that is not to come after necessarily, and I'm not against any kind of intellectual exploration and questions of the history of orthodoxy, heterodoxy. I think all that's fine. But for me, the way to get at this problem that we're talking about is to come at that original impatience, the original desire to walk away from the trajectory in the book of Acts. Because in the book of Acts, what we know, we're not the point. That's not the point. The point is whether Israel will accept us, not whether we're going to accept Israel. It's whether we are the question. We are the beautiful question God is asking Israel. Do you see what I'm doing in the world? And will you accept what I'm doing in the world? That's the beauty of it. What does it mean to be a question to people who believe they already have the answer? And in some ways, I would prefer to have that as a position from which to think the question of orthodoxy and heterodoxy. What does it mean to be a question to people who already think they have the answer?
Thank you.
You're more than welcome.
That was beautiful, and I think it's so perfect for the next question that James Jones would like to ask you, Dr. Jennings. James, are you there?
Thank you, Dr. Jennings, for being here. It's really great to have you here. And also thank you to the organizers for letting students and alumni crash the event. It's really cool. So anyway, you already answered part of this in your response to Professor Wickman's question. So feel free to ignore those parts that you've already addressed, but I would really like to answer this particular question, because by the time I got to the part where you were talking about, I hope I'm saying this right, Ola Uda Equiano's part of the book, I saw myself in that a lot, because I'm like, here's a guy who is trying to involve himself with these other Christians, these people that are supposed to see him as a brother, and they don't, you know? you talked about this in the introduction of your book as well. You talked about, those missionaries showing up to your house and be like, oh, we're Christians too. How do y'all not see that? And there's supposed to be that intimacy there that doesn't exist. And really the intimacy doesn't exist because these are some white folks and, I'm a Black body trying to move into this space. So in trying to, like for me as a Black man who's a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I'm constantly holding this tension of trying to be like Ola Uda Equiano and attempting to create relationships and space for myself among several people that don't look like me, and Exodus narratives that exist in both the Bible and the Book of Mormon, where ethnic oppression has led to a nonviolent exodus. So I was going to ask you, can you say a little bit more about the kind of responsibilities that people like us have in integrating and diversifying the Christian community while also preserving our own mental health and holding that intention in what occasionally can be an ambivalent and hostile space?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brother Jones, for that wonderful question. The great thing about that chapter, Olaudah Equiano's chapter, is that he shows the tragedy, the melancholy that comes to so many people of the African diaspora when they enter the Christian commune. What is that? That is not a commune. It's not a commune, and they long for a commune. It's why, I say, this is one of the reasons why there are so many people of African descent who dutifully go to churches, dutifully participate in their religious communities, but they carry a sadness, and they do it dutifully, but in many ways they don't find it compelling, but they do it because they know they should do it. And the reason they don't find it compelling is because what is yet to emerge? What is yet to emerge is a reality of belonging that they spied out when they said yes to this faith. It was a reality of belonging that they saw that was there. And so what is necessary? What is necessary is not what's necessary for them. It's not what's necessary for people of the African diaspora. It's what's necessary for those who have been shaped inside white Christianity. As I was saying in my lecture, that is, they have to walk away from a controlling intimacy that says it's only intimacy if it allows me to continue to sense my own control, if it allows me to continue to shape my own sense of what is safe, what is comfortable, and what is normal. See, this is the problem. The problem is what so many people don't understand is that when we say white Christianity in a derogatory word, that's what we mean. White Christianity in a derogatory way, not a kind of sociological definition or even a kind of actually sociological or anthropological definition, but in its theological definition and sense, is that it is precisely a way of life that seeks control as exactly what intimacy looks like. And so the challenge is for people to change that reality. I was having coffee with this wonderful pastor who, I won't tell you the city because you might figure this out, but I was having coffee with this wonderful pastor, and in his church, a lot of the people of color, the Black folks especially, were leaving the church. This was shortly after some of the national things going on that I don't need to name. But people were leaving his church. And he couldn't understand why, because he said, well, we're trying to build an inclusive community here. We're trying to build a multicultural church. And he had an African-American woman who was his assistant. And I said, well, what has she said to you about it? And he really didn't have much to say about what she had said to him about it. And then he told me that she came up to him just recently before we had our little coffee and said, I'm going to be leaving the church. And he was stunned. Why are you leaving the church? And then I asked him, I said, well, how have you included her? How have you opened your life and the church's life to her and her leadership? And this is the story he told me. He said, well, recently, I told her that I really want to learn more about African American life. Now, this is a man with a PhD, and he's a pastor of this church. He called this African American woman into his office and said, dear sister, I want to just says, dear sister, I really want to learn more about African American church. Would you get me a list of books that you think I ought to read? Write that up for me and give it to me. And then I will, and then tell me which ones I should be reading first. And then I'll go from, and then I stopped him right there. I said, no, my dear brother, let me ask you something. So you have a PhD, right? He said, yes, I have a PhD. So you know how to do research, right? I said, yes, I know how to do research. So let me paint the picture for you. So you who know how to do research, how to find out anything you need to find out, you called this African American woman who's supposed to be your colleague in ministry, your sister, and you said to her, A, go get a list for me. B, give me the list in terms of what I ought to read. C, make sure you evaluate which books I should have and then give it to me. I said, do you see anything wrong with that? He sat there for a while and thought, oh, I mean, slowly after the second cup of coffee, it finally dawned on him that he had made her a service provider for him in this church. And she was supposed to be his sister in Christ, his colleague in ministry. So I said, what would have been better is for you to go do your research. Because you know how to do research. Read many books. Come to her and say, could we talk? Because I've read things and I want you to help me understand if I'm getting this right. That is, make her your teacher. That in a sense, you are coming to her because you're building relationship. You're showing that you are taking the initiative, just like you did to get that PhD. You're showing the initiative to build toward her. Now, I tell that story because part of the struggle for so many people of color, especially people of African descent, is that they are in contexts where churches and communities have been formed where the people of color are service providers, emotional service providers. And even in that work, what's still being created is a sense of intimacy that constantly nurtures and protects a sense of safety, comfort, and normalcy for white Christianity. So that's the work that has to happen. And so what so many people of color have to do is to simply point. That's the work you got to do. Just point. Don't do it. That's the work they got to do. And speak about the hope. Speak about the hope. Speak about the sorrow of what's not there, as Alado Aquilano did so beautifully. But then he spoke about the hope. He hoped that someday there could be confraternity, was the old word he used, between white and black. He speak about that hope. Keep speaking about that hope, but don't do the work. And invite sisters and brothers to do the work. But now, of course, Brother Jones, here's the key. People have to be able to want a deeper reality of belonging. And to get there, as I said in my lecture, we have to see that the Spirit of God wants to crumble from within the way in which we've constructed safety, the way in which we've constructed comfort, the way in which we've constructed what is normal, in order to build the new that is in the multitude. Imagine a people who feel safe and comfortable and normal when they are in the midst of a diverse group of people that they don't control. That's key. So I think that's what we need.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. Really appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. And thank you for that great question.
Yeah, that was a great exchange. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. Another question, good question, intimacy by Carrie O'Grady. Carrie, are you there?
I see.
I'm here. Thank you, Dr. Jennings, for all that you've shared already, but also thank you, Dr. Jones. My question now seems small compared to the dialogue that just happened. So I appreciate that interchange. That was important. So when I began to formulate my question was back when you were talking about this oneness, that's an additive oneness as opposed to a subtractive oneness, right?
Yes.
That colonizing kind of oneness. And I'm hearing you sort of articulate that as white people placing themselves in the center of control, it's a sort of a pseudo intimacy in which we feel we are connecting, but we're not, because as long as we have to be in complete control, there cannot be true intimacy, right? Mm-hmm. And then you had mentioned that as you were describing this type of oneness, that this is something that Christianity or religious people might be able to embrace, but not beyond that. But I thought the question I had was, well, how do we bridge that gap? So in other words, you're saying it isn't fully embraced from a political or an economic or a social realm necessarily outside of Christianity. And yet I wondered from kind of a practical theology perspective, how that might be the case, because I'm just thinking in our own home, I'm also a mother in addition to being a professor. So when we tell, if I were to tell my child, I'm making these decisions for our home based on equity, not equality, right? I'm making sure all the needs are met according to how I understand them. And their altruism isn't great enough, nor do I believe most adults' altruism is great enough for them to accept that idea. However, when I try to help them understand that then they get to live in a home life that's more meaningful, that's more rich, that's a benefit that they can only get from that kind of, I guess it's a vulnerability in a way, maybe I'm describing. But in that regard, it actually does create an economic, a social, a political space that is, if all we care about is I want to make sure I get my benefits, I want to make sure I get what I need, that's how you get it. You create a world that is more meaningful, more rich, where all have what is needed. So I think sometimes as Christian folks, or when we're having a theological discussion, we're uncertain about how to help articulate that as a social idea rather than just a theological idea. So I wondered if you had some thoughts regarding that.
Well, thank you, Dr. O'Grady, for that. And I agree with your observation and insight on that. One of the challenges for us is that we often forget that the theological is already deeply material, right? So, and what I mean by that, so he took bread and he took wine. He said, "This is my body. This is my blood. Eat this, all of you." And very material and very theological at the same time. And so part of the challenge is, how do we ground desire in the actual ground? How do we ground desire? How do we take hold of desire? Because at the end of the day, what drives this forward, what brings it into the deepest reality of the practical and practice, is that we open ourselves to the desire of God. So let's take the book of Acts for a second. I'll come back to the book of Acts again. I mentioned this in the lecture, but I think it's so important to remember this. So in the book of Acts, when the Spirit comes, the fundamental sign of the Spirit is that people are being asked and compelled to do what they don't want to do. In Acts 1, the disciples wanted power. In Acts 2, the Spirit falls on them, they're speaking in the mother tongues of other people. The disciples are being told to go join this person, go over here, go over there. It's like, okay, the Spirit is like really directed. I don't want to do that. My favorite story is the second Ananias story, the one where he's told to go to Paul. Saul to soon become Paul. And what's so great about that story is that Ananias turns to the angel and says, "Rumor has it that this guy's a killer." you might want to let God know the rumors because maybe God has the wrong person he wants me to go to. I just love that story. I can imagine the angel going, oh my God. No, we want you to go to him. So, but you're exactly right. I mean, part of the challenge is to help people step into, help our families, help our friends, help our communities to step into a deeper reality of grounded desire. So how do we facilitate the grounding of desire that God wants? How do we facilitate forming, as I was saying earlier, opening ourselves up, aligning our lives so that there is a crumbling that's taking place? Here's what we know about social structures, the social fabrics we live in. We know that they are not solid, that they are actually energies that takes an incredible amount of attention, effort, ingenuity, and creativity to sustain. And so the question is, how might we redirect those energies towards something else to start the crumbling and start the rebuilding toward a different sense of what is safe? Crumble what's we think is comfortable, start to build a different sense of what's comfortable. That's possible. And as you were saying, it has a lot to do with how one positions the trajectory that the stories we live inside is pointing us toward how we will yet live, how we imagine the future of our lives together. And in our next time together, next week when we start to talk about the after whiteness, part of what we're going to talk about is really that work of aspiration and what it means to set it correctly. But I think that's where we must begin.
Thank you. And Carrie, thank you for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. That was very helpful.
You're more than welcome. More than welcome.
So our next question we have is from Francesca Lawson. And hopefully, Adam, if she's queued, she would like to ask this. If not, I will for her.
I've got it. Thank you so much.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you. Professor Jennings, I am just so inspired by what you're saying. I am deeply touched by it. And I completely agree with you that I believe it's our sacred responsibility to learn the stories of others and to be able to tell those stories. However, and you also mentioned earlier that from a religious standpoint, we have certain directives as Christians, as Christian scholars. But when we're outside of that realm, when we're with scholars in other fields, we're not, who are not Christian, it's the prevailing attitude, at least in my field right now, that especially a white scholar does not have the right to be able to tell someone else's story. And there's a good reason for that too. There have been many instances where we've had ethnographers going into other cultures and sort of presuming that they have the knowledge, the expertise, and the right to be able to tell those stories. Right. So it's been abused. It's been abused. I mean, I was just teaching a class. I teach a class on South Asian humanities, and we were talking about the movie Slumdog Millionaire, which was a great hit in the West. It was deeply offensive in India because Danny Boyle, the British director, completely misunderstood what he was trying to do. He was trying to sort of ape a Bollywood movie. And the point is, he misrepresented the culture.
Right.
And so there is certainly a record of that. But I guess my question to you is, how do I am like you, deeply moved by the need for us to understand and tell other narratives, other people's narratives. What do we say to our colleagues who come in and say, you don't have the right to do that. You don't have the right. What do I say? What would be your wisdom?
Dr. Lawson, thank you for that great question. And this is such a crucial matter for how we understand our intellectual work. I'm going to spend some time talking about this the next lecture, but this is a crucial matter. So let's come back to one word I used earlier when we were talking about land. And that word is the word possession. And I made that really important distinction between possession of and possession by. Possession of is the reality of the West, the reality of ownership. And it is a reality that undergirds so much of the Western educational disposition, mastery of. And it is inside that legacy that so many lives are mishandled, as you and I know so well. So many lives are mishandled. Even to this moment, they are mishandled. I mean, the reality of so many places called museums, as we know, continues this reality of the mishandling of lives. But there is another way to think about that moves away from that and the possession by. So here's the question. What would it mean for me to speak the story of another beside another? That is to say, to speak the story of another and implicate myself as one who has entered or seeks to enter or seeks to honor and who waits upon, right? Waits upon that possibility. You know, I'm sure you've met them and I have met them too, those careful scholars who through the work of life together have earned the right, not because they say they've earned the right, but because this other one said, yes, she's earned the right. You have not. She's earned the right. And now here's the problem for us. Those words, I have earned the right, they still have not entered the lexicon of intellectual formation. They still have not entered the reality of the work of so many people who imagine themselves properly handling the materials of indigenous peoples. And so the question becomes, how might we bring those words, I have earned the right, fully into the intellectual milieu that shapes so many of us? Now, here, Dr. Lawson, that's a theological matter. That's a theological matter. And this is where I think there is a particular calling for those of us, of those people, of us who are people of faith, in how we show what it means to not simply speak a story, but to live a storied existence. That's what I was saying earlier. What it means to be a great storyteller is not just how you handle stories, but how the stories handle you, how the stories move and reform you, reshape you. And this is where we continue to fail, not only as Christian intellectuals, but as intellectuals outside of Christianity. As we know, one of the great problems we face is that we still are in the hierarchy of knowledge. And so I know many people who, they might honor the stories of other peoples, but once they have had a cup of coffee or a drink or two, what they'll say is, well, if I want to do serious, rigorous thought, obviously it's not going to, they're great, but if I'm getting serious, I'm going to, stick with the Europeans. And of course, what's being stated there is precisely what leads to the statement, they have not earned the right. I don't care how well they've mastered my people's language. I don't care how much of an encyclopedic knowledge they have of our stories and of our culture and of our land. They haven't earned the right. Because in point of fact, at the end of the day, either because it's simply at the level of their expertise or at the level of it's a tool for their professional progress in the academy, it's inconsequential to who they actually are. And so, but what that means for me, and I think what that means for us is that doesn't mean hands off. It means lives enter. And unfortunately, and I'm sure you experience this too, I meet so many people who they have never gotten the memo that their lives are at stake in the literal sense of the word. To stake, your life is now staked next to, inside of this reality that you are studying. I was doing a workshop, I won't tell you this school, but I was doing a workshop at this particular school, and there was a guy who was an expert, a well-renowned expert in a particular African-American figure. And it was simply his job, his shtick. It was just the thing he did. There was no deep commitment to any community of color, but he was committed to having mastery of this particular person. And I listened to him talk, and I thought, if that person were alive today, he would come over to you and say, please stop handling my life, because you're killing me every time you do. But I don't want to end on a negative note, on a positive note. There is such a tremendous possibility of rethinking what it means to honor the stories of other people, if in fact we start to create a different intellectual formation that surprises those peoples by our deep love for them.
Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome.
Okay, there's one we have here from Gideon. Let me see. Do you want to ask this question, Leader, or should I ask it?
I can ask Gideon's question, sure.
Okay.
Here's what Gideon asked. I'm curious what influence the first and second Great Awakenings had on race and Christianity in America. And has there been a significant Christian movement that has embodied any of the solutions that you have talked about today?
Oh, that's a great question. The great historian, Albert Rabbitoe, talks about this in his work, in which he said that during those Great Awakenings and through what I call the revivalist tradition that follows, that revivalist tradition, that one would often find, even for a moment, slaves, poor whites, and the master class. One would find in those moments of conversion a shared ecstasy, a shared experience, and a shared love, even if only for a moment. The problem, obviously, as Dr. Rabbitoe points out in his work, is that it was only for a moment. You know, when the ecstasy of the conversion moment ended, they returned to this racial order of things. But in that moment, let's come back to that moment. In that moment in which you could have a slave preaching to the master and the master's family and the master's children and converting them. You could have a master preaching to slaves, or the master class preaching to slaves, and claiming through tear and sweat that they are brother and sister. There in that moment, you saw the radical egalitarian impulse of the gospel on full display, and the power of it to overturn the racial order. The tragedy is that the revivalist impulse, the revivalist tradition, was never strong enough in and of itself to overcome the ongoing energies that structured the racial order. And those energies always pushed against that moment being extended in space and time. But we can find throughout the history, especially of American Christianity, those episodes, those moments. Many people talk about it at the founding of the Azusa Street revival experience. Many talk about it in various moments of revival across the country, where the moments in which Black and white and indigenous come and poor and wealthy come together in moments of profound, profound realities of being touched by God. But it's not been powerful enough. Now, my hope is that the lesson could be learned, and it could be learned with a question. What would happen if we took that radical experience of conversion, that radical experience of feeling the Spirit touch the body, and extend it in space and time, extend it to such an extent that it becomes a way of life? At that point, what it means to enter revival becomes what it means to enter the Christian life. But sadly, unfortunately, it hasn't moved in that direction. You know, and we could spend time talking about the ways in which the revivalist tradition, by revivalist tradition, I mean all those churches and denominations and religious bodies that their vision of faith built on the radical inbreaking of God, taking hold of the body, touching the heart, people sensing and knowing God's gracious salvation, God's forgiveness, tangibly, experientially. And from that, starting to envision the Christian life. But we know that that reality has been subverted and used to, in many ways, deepen the stranglehold of whiteness on so many people.
Thank you for that. I got a question I'd like to ask you myself, if it's okay, Professor Jennings.
Of course.
You know, the Christian life, as I understand it, involves reaching up toward God and reaching out toward others.
Yeah.
Also reaching deeply within ourselves, right? You kind of go up, out, and within. And I'm thinking about the kinds of criticisms that one hears on occasion of our contemporary culture. I'm thinking about especially what you said about reverse assimilation this morning. You know, at one level, it's about really listening carefully to each other and adopting sensibilities and customs and trying to learn about other cultures. But there is a line of criticism, it's largely Marxian, right, that says that in our late capitalist moment, that kind of thing tends to be highly consumerist, you know, and it's superficial and it forgets historical differences, and it treats all periods of history as though they were period piece movies or this kind of thing. It doesn't. The question really is this: are we the kinds of people in our current moment who are able to achieve the vision that you set forth? Or is there something else that we need to do in reaching within before we're able to reach out in the right way?
Well, I mean, one of the things I always want to be careful of is I never look for purity. God has always worked inside the mixtures, right? So reaching down deeply inside Roman culture and people's deep embeddedness inside its multiple currents and drawing them to the gospel, the gospel light. So I think it is that same ability that the Spirit of God has always shown through, through uneven Christian community that we want to hold on to. So that, we are all caught up in the commodification of everything. And I think this is an inescapable truth. We're caught up in the bifurcations and the fragmentations that constitute so much of the way we imagine the good and the true and the beautiful. And as we talked about in the lecture, the good, the true, and the beautiful are so deeply are now permeated with the problems of whiteness. But even with all that, there is the possibility of the overturning. And this is what I always want to hold on to. God gives the ability to overturn. And we obviously we see this in so many communities. I mean, we see this in so many communities. I always say the great miracle of modernity is that so many people of African descent and so many indigenous peoples actually became Christian. They actually became Christian. And how is that? It's, we could say, well, it's internalization, psychological control, but that dishonors the profound realities of agency. They spied out something different in the midst of the morass. And unfortunately, as you and I know, Dr. Whitman, there's so many theorists, critical theorists, so many historians, they refuse to give people that kind of agency. They refuse to give people that kind of intelligence, which I've always been amazed at how people can be so inhuman to the very folks that they think that they're trying to speak of their humanity. So
that's a vision I embrace very much, Professor Jennings. I appreciate. I wanted to get to that question because I wanted to get to the question of interiority somewhat about how this plays in. It's a beautiful answer. It's also spelled out really nicely, I think, in your last chapter of your book. So thank you very much.
You're more than welcome.
So I was supposed to ask a question, but I don't think I will ask my questions this time, because I really feel strongly about this next question.
Oh, okay.
By Justin Martinez. If you are there, Adam, to cue him in, this might be our final question.
Yeah. I came into the session late, but I've really enjoyed what I've been learning and listening to, and was really fascinated by that quote of Emilio Aguinaldo, because my grandfather was born in the decades following the Philippine-American War, and I just taught that to my students where I teach in the Salt Lake Valley. So I'm extremely multicultural. I was born in the Central Valley of California. Like I said, I'm ethnically Filipino. I'm also ethnically Mexican. Both sides are immigrants. I was educated in the Intermountain West. I have TESOL education training. I'm extremely multicultural again. I came into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in my late teens. I proselyted in South America, and I've attended congregations all over the American West. And I am very sensitive to multiculturalism within Christianity, especially within my own faith community. What do you see within multiculturalism that we can better ingrain in American, or rather Christian orthodoxy and orthopraxy, especially in lieu of so many younger Americans who, while may seek for spirituality, are not necessarily affiliated with any institutional churches, with perhaps some of what you've done with your ministry and your education and helping Christians to be active in the church?
So Dr. Martinez, let me repeat back the question because I want to make sure I got it. So you're asking what can be done in terms of creating multicultural community that help me understand. I think I lost the last part of your question, what you said. Say it, so give it to me again. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah. Millennials and those that are coming afterwards seem to be less religious.
I got you. Okay.
And while the older generations are still active, especially in my faith community in the church, what can we do as the United States is becoming more multicultural, more interracial, to appeal to my generation and to those that follow and my kids, so that they can still affiliate with and be involved with the church amid the commonalities of their age groups, of my age group, to not do so?
Yeah, great question. I got you. Thank you so much for that clarification. I really appreciate it. So, this is one of the ways where I think we often fail younger generations. And the failure is in not presenting to them the possibilities and not presenting to them the calling to gather, to form community. But now here's what's key. It's the forming community with those they would prefer not to be with. It's the forming of community with those who are not of like mind, but who are sites of divine desire. One of the challenges, and this gets back to something I said earlier, Dr. Martinez, when I was talking about to Dr. I think it was O'Hare or O'Malley. I'm sorry, I can't remember. But you know, one of the problems we have is that we have not, those of us who are Christian, have never gotten the memo about participating in the desire of God for others. And so we have not, in many ways, created the kind of educational structures, the kind of formation structures that speak to younger people and say, the task is not for you to come and just quote unquote align with our thinking. Is to see what we are seeing ourselves being drawn by, the desire of God to form community, to see that we are ourselves trying to yield to where the Spirit of God is trying to take us, to become people who gather, as I'm going to talk about in the next lecture, to become people who are able to sense and then to enter into fully the desire of God to connect, to implicate, to draw people together. So what does this mean? To say to a young person is not, you know, I'm glad you have some friends, but there's more, there's more that's possible. And so what would it mean to enter into what we ourselves, those who are older than you, are trying to enter into? A life that gathers, a way of being together, a way that crosses boundary and border, a way that starts to build what others think is impossible. People who should, for every regular reason, be enemies, who are, in point of fact, not simply friends, but moving toward a deep sharing of life, a life that already, by its very nature, signals that bread has been shared and wine has been drunk, that a meal has already happened and more meals are in store. That makes sense?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Wow. What another wonderful hour and a half, Professor Jennings. I hope you hear the applause in many locations around our community here. Absolutely wonderful. Now, before anybody leaves this wonderful afternoon, I hope you realize that we'll be back here again next Friday. And I think we've all seen that we have in Professor Jennings not only a brilliant intellect, a great scholar, but a pastor who is communicating what is deeply in his heart as a devout Christian and what we as Christians can share with him and do going forward. And next week, his book, After Whiteness, An Education in Belonging. I think we've all, many of you wonderful question askers, go to the question, what can be done about it? What can I do about this? What can we do to improve? And next week, we're going to get an education in belonging, in moving toward that aspiration of shared humanity, of the commune that he so eloquently describes. That's what's on the docket next Friday. So be sure to be here. And for those of you that have been with us this session or through all of the sessions, thank you so much. What a credit to you and what you care deeply about. We appreciate you. And I so appreciate the four here. And I would like Adam and Andrew to come on, show yourselves now, because Andrew and especially Adam, who has invested so many hours into this. I think any of you who put on a program know that the people behind the scenes invest a huge amount of time. And of course, they're humble, they don't want attention. Adam didn't want attention, but I'm going to give it to him because he's been an absolutely amazing collaborator and friend and insightful in so many ways that have made this go well. And the same with Andy, who's joined us recently in this endeavor and guided us in many ways. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you to Lita and Matt. Crowd out there, can you not see why I chose Lita and Matt to kind of be your MCs in these events? Tremendous people, insightful, people of heart and love and passion, very much like our Professor Jennings. We love you all. We appreciate you. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you and good day.